So in 2017, I got an assignment from this magazine called the California Sunday Magazine, where I was working as a staff writer at the time, to profile Sam Altman. And I remember at one point, I sat in on a meeting between Altman and some entrepreneurs he'd funded, and I watched as he pulled out his phone, and he showed these entrepreneurs a video of a robot solving a Rubik's Cube with one hand. And one of the entrepreneurs asks Altman when he thinks AI is going to start replacing human workers. And Altman equivocates at first, and then he brings up horses, specifically what happened to horses when cars were invented. And here's what he says. For a while, horses found slightly different jobs, and today, there are no more jobs for horses. So I don't have to tell you all the difference between horses and humans, which is that humans are human, which is why we tend to be particularly worried this time around about how technology is changing the world. So 3 years later, OpenAI starts letting people try this technology called GPT-3, which sounds like ChatGPT because it's the same underlying technology. It's a technology that uses AI to write text. I still had Altman's number from that profile I'd written of him, so I wrote to him and I said I'd like to try it out. I was curious as an artist about what it would feel like to write with something like this. And I was also thinking of my novel again. I'd been working on it at that point for more than a decade, and I was wondering if I could learn something from this experience that would tell me something about AI. So here I need to give you a little bit of context about the novel. It is about a precocious kid named King Rao who grows up on a coconut plantation in South India in the 1950s. And he ends up moving to the US and studying computer science in the 1970s and eventually becoming the CEO of the world's most powerful tech corporation, which is the tech corporation that ends up engineering this takeover of the world's governments and putting itself in charge, with King Rao in charge of the government. So everything, as I said, in this society is overseen by AI, from criminal justice to education to jobs, everything. And the story in this novel is narrated by King's daughter, Athena, who's starting to question some of her dad's decisions. And long story short, and without giving too much away, in the end, government by AI algorithm doesn't go that well. So the thing is that development in the novel's plot mapped to my experience reporting on the evolution of the race to develop AI. In the years since I'd profiled Altman, the people behind OpenAI had changed it from a nonprofit organization, which is what it had started as, to a for-profit company. And they cited essentially the cost of doing business. And other big companies at the time, like Google and Facebook, were starting to work on AI as well. And here I want to pause and just briefly explain how these language-producing AI models work. It's actually not that complicated. What happens is these companies feed the models a huge amount of text that's typically grabbed from the internet, something in the order of, I have to look at this because it's hard for me to believe too, hundreds of billions of words, so that they can learn, these models can learn the patterns and relationships among these words, essentially learn how language works. And then when someone like you or me is using one of these, we type some words, and these models predict the words that are likeliest to come next based on what they've learned about language. So nowadays, most of the models we're familiar with are chatbots like ChatGPT. And so what they're doing in that context is we're giving them a question, and they're essentially predicting the likeliest answer and giving us that answer. But back when I wrote to Altman, these chatbots didn't exist yet. And so what OpenAI did was it gave me access to this web page called the Playground. And in the Playground, you could write some text and press a button which would prompt GPT-3, which was this AI model, to finish the text for you. So I started by trying to write a piece of short fiction, a short story. I wrote a couple of sentences, and then I tapped the button, and GPT-3 continued. And then I wrote some more, and tapped again, and GPT-3 continued again. I wrote a bit more, tapped again, and so on. And what got to me was the way that GPT-3 seemed to keep being able to unstick me. I'd been a writer my whole adult life, and the job, in my experience, had so far consisted largely in thinking for a long time about what the right next word should be and not being able to figure it out, and then finally figuring it out, and then getting stuck again. And this process would last, and this isn't just true of me, it's true, I think, of all writers. The process could last weeks or months. In the case of my novel, by that point, it had lasted more than a decade, right? So in this context, a tool that could generate words for me seemed like a revelation. And I started thinking about the one big event of my life for which I could never find words. My older sister had died of cancer when we were both in college. 20 years had passed since then, and I had been more or less speechless about it ever since. So one night, I went to GPT-3 with this sentence. My sister was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma when I was in my freshman year of high school, and she was in her junior year. The essay that resulted was a 9-part drafting and redrafting with GPT-3's help of what happened after that. So at first, GPT-3 picked up where my sentence about my sister's diagnosis left off, and I'm going to read it to you. Here's my sentence again. My sister was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma when I was in my freshman year of high school, and she was in her junior year. And here's how GPT-3 continued. I had just started playing lacrosse, and she was really excited for that. I don't think I really understood what Ewing sarcoma was. I just knew it was a type of cancer. When I went to visit her in the hospital, it was really the first time I was able to see what this disease was and how it affects the body. She went through a lot of different treatments and was in and out of the hospital for a long time. It was hard to see my sister go through that. I wasn't able to see much of her during her treatment, and I wanted to be there for her. I was able to visit her a lot, but there were times where I couldn't because we were on the road playing lacrosse. Eventually, she went into remission and got the all clear and was able to play lacrosse with me for a season. I was a freshman and she was a senior, so that was really cool when she got to play again. She had a lot of friends at school and people who supported her. I think that was really special for her because she had a lot of support from people she didn't even know. She's doing great now. That last line gutted me. She's doing great now. So I realized I needed to explain to GPT-3 that my sister had died. And so I try again. And this time I add more about what had really happened. The fact of my sister's death, the fact of my grief over it. And this time GPT-3 acknowledges the loss, but then it decides I'm going to turn into a runner, raising funds for the Children's Cancer Society. Literally, it writes, I started a running streak when I was a high school senior to raise money for the Children's Cancer Society. I've run every day since. And it goes on to talk about my life as a runner. So I looked up the Children's Cancer Society, and it doesn't exist. There's something called the National Children's Cancer Society, but the Children's Cancer Society is a fiction. And by the way, the notion that I would choose to run unless being chased, also a fiction. So I try again. In total, I try 9 times, and each time I'm deleting what the AI wrote the previous time, and I'm writing more in my words. But a funny thing starts to happen as I do this, which is that each time, GPT-3 actually gets closer to describing something like what grief felt like to me. What was happening was that, as I wrote more, the most obvious next sentences, the most probable next sentences, according to the AI's sort of statistical analysis, were inevitably sentences that were somewhat more like me. And all of this was moving and sometimes exhilarating, but it was also frightening. Because I was starting to understand that the essay was only partly about my grief. It was also about what it meant for me and for all of us to make use of a technology that promised to help us describe the world and our experiences, our deepest experiences, from our perspective. So Ghosts was published in a magazine called The Believer in the summer of 2021, and it pretty much immediately went viral. And soon I was starting to receive emails from other people who had lost loved ones and felt like the piece captured grief better than anything else they'd ever read. It was adapted for This American Life. It was selected for something called the Best American Essays, which is a collection of a bunch of essays that are judged to be the best in a given year. Basically, it was more well-received by far than anything else I'd ever written up to that point. And I thought I should feel proud of this, and to an extent I did. But I was ambivalent, right? Because GPT-3 didn't share the byline. It wasn't named as an author. But I felt like on an artistic level, I could only take partial credit for what had been written in the piece. And I was also aware that AI could threaten a lot of people's livelihoods, including my own. And I worried that ghosts could be read as some kind of stake in the ground, right? Kind of arguing implicitly in favor of AI to produce literature. When the truth was that I wasn't sure how I felt about any of it.